The conversation begins with a lament over the transformation of Britain from a once mighty empire that controlled a quarter of the world to a diminished welfare state struggling with internal crises. Piers Morgan acknowledges that Britain has changed considerably, citing demographic changes and immigration as significant factors. He notes that London, once almost entirely white, is now about 36% white in the city itself and about 70% white nationally. Morgan emphasizes that this transformation is altering the fabric and culture of the country, leading to debates about what it means to be British today. Morgan stresses that immigration, both legal and illegal, has placed enormous strain on Britain's infrastructure, especially the National Health Service, NHS. He points out that public services are creaking at the seams, with a net migration close to 1 million per year at one point, which he sees as unsustainable. While he appreciates the individual contributions of immigrants and does not harbor racial animus towards them, he argues that the cultural dilution caused by mass migration is undeniable. Morgan contends that the native British population feels invaded and diminished, an observation reinforced by patterns of poverty and social unrest in immigrant-heavy areas. The National Health Service is discussed extensively. Both hosts agree it once worked better, but now suffers under pressure from increased demand and poor political management across multiple governments. Morgan cites personal anecdotes about his parents' experiences with delayed and overcrowded emergency care, even though the specialist treatment was excellent once they accessed it. The issue of funding and infrastructure strain is linked tightly to the increased population and immigration pressure. The British economy is broadly characterized as having shifted from manufacturing and industry towards banking, finance, and real estate, especially in London. Morgan claims this shift is problematic because it represents an economy less about creation and production and more about managing and lending money. This economic base, combined with socio-political challenges, contributes to stagnation and a general sense of decline. The conversation touches on pollution and traffic congestion in London as unintended consequences of this economic shift. Morgan and Tucker Carlson reflect on how British culture, characterized by politeness, self-restraint, patriotism, and Christian roots, has weakened. The rise of secularism, the increase in people with no religious beliefs, and diminished national pride are cited as causes. Morgan laments that basic courtesies like men opening doors for women are now frowned upon, attributed to modern feminist and toxic masculinity culture. The declining use and respect for British symbols, such as the Union Jack, is also noted as evidence of lost pride and self-respect. A significant portion of the discussion centers on the state of free speech. Morgan agrees that Britain has become increasingly authoritarian in its approach to speech crimes, with a strikingly high number of arrests for expression compared to other countries, including Russia. Specific cases, such as people being arrested for praying outside abortion clinics or using certain words, are cited as troubling examples. Morgan acknowledges that while political correctness and woke culture started with good intentions, they have mutated into oppressive mechanisms that suppress dissent and critical debate. The case of comedian Graham Lahan being arrested and later released due to public backlash exemplifies the clash between authoritarianism and public sentiment. Trans issues and the woke left are discussed critically. Both agree that the movement suppresses free speech and enforces ideological conformity with brutal cancel culture tactics. Morgan condemns the persecution of critics of trans ideology, but tries to differentiate between legitimate rights and abusive enforcement. He laments the hypocrisy of suppressing speech under the guise of protecting marginalized groups, claiming that it mirrors fascistic behavior despite its progressive veneer. The declining birth rate among the native British population is identified as a key underlying problem. Morgan points out that abortion rates among the native population are very high, while immigrant communities tend to have more children due to optimism and cultural pride. The discussion extends to the West broadly, linking demographic decline, abortion, contraception, and the loss of will to perpetuate culture as intertwined existential threats. The interview touches upon the idea that Westerners are participating in their own demographic replacement through choices that diminish reproduction. Morgan notes indicators of social malaise visible in British cities: litter, graffiti, poor personal grooming, drug and alcohol abuse, that symbolize a population that feels defeated and diminished. He connects these phenomena to a loss of self-respect and dignity, suggesting that societal decay is both a symptom and cause of cultural collapse. This theme parallels the historical narrative of indigenous peoples who, though once proud and self-reliant, were defeated and thereafter declined. Throughout the conversation, race and identity are discussed carefully. Morgan insists he does not hate any group and claims to have more affinity with religious immigrant groups than with certain white liberals. The unwillingness to discuss demographic facts openly due to fear of being labeled racist is emphasized. Morgan denounces hate of any kind, whether it targets Muslims, Christians, or Jews, but criticizes the racial and cultural politics that make honest discourse virtually impossible in Britain. Both express disappointment with British politicians across the political spectrum, blaming them for failing to control borders, mismanaging immigration policy, and diminishing Britain's global standing. Figures such as Tony Blair and Boris Johnson are criticized for either poor judgment or incompetence. While Boris Johnson is described as an authoritarian buffoon, the wider political system is faulted for fostering suppression of free speech and enabling cultural decline. Throughout the interview, parallels are drawn to similar trends in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe, emphasizing that Britain's experience is not unique but symptomatic of a broader Western malaise. The erosion of traditional values, rise of multiculturalism, and demographic changes are themes observed across these societies, affecting their cohesion and future prospects. Despite criticisms, both speakers show affection for Britain, particularly London's vibrant multiculturalism, gastronomy, and cultural contributions like literature and science. Morgan expresses pride in British achievements, but insists that to regain its greatness, the country must confront uncomfortable truths about identity, culture, and political realities. Morgan is praised as a defender of free speech in a British media environment largely constricted by political correctness and censorship. His role as a platform for debated voices is recognized as a rare beacon of open discourse in an edifice increasingly hostile to dissenting opinions. The paradox of a declining country with some enduring cultural strengths and debate opportunities is underscored. An extended dialogue covers the politics around offensive language relating to race and sexuality. Morgan and Carlson debate the use and reclamation of slurs within communities, questioning the efficacy and consequences of policing language by law. They agree on the value of free speech and express skepticism about the utility of restrictions that often seem arbitrary or hypocritical. Morgan discusses the rising self-identification as gay or transgender, the cultural and scientific aspects behind it, and the implications for birth rates and societal health. He admits uncertainty about the causes and asserts most are sincere, while expressing concern about cultural propaganda and its effects on sexuality and reproduction. They discuss how societal acceptance and visibility of LGBTQ+ identities contrast with traditional and immigrant communities' views, linking this to broader cultural transformations. Christianity's decline in the UK is noted, with fewer individuals professing religious belief. Morgan points out that despite this, Britain remains a majority Christian country, unlike more secular societies. The erosion of Christian values is positioned as a contributor to the loss of social cohesion, patriotism, and moral clarity. The conversation highlights how patriotic displays like flying the Union Jack or openly expressing pride in the nation have become controversial or stigmatized. Morgan remarks on how British people increasingly distance themselves from their identity, contrasting with the strong patriotism seen in America. He laments the rise of self-hatred among native populations as a deep cultural problem. They discuss Britain's entry into World War II, debating whether it was truly voluntary or necessitated by the threat to Europe. Morgan defends the narrative that Britain stood against the Nazis to defend civilization, while Carlson challenges aspects of that history. They acknowledge the war's devastating impact on Britain's economy and status, sparking a chain of decline and loss of influence. Morgan addresses crime rates, particularly knife violence in London, noting that while still high, they are lower than in many American cities. He credits current Mayor Sadiq Khan with some improvements, but acknowledges ongoing challenges with poverty and social disorder. The final threads ponder what future Britain, and by extension, the Western world, might hold. Concerns focus on demographic trends, cultural continuity, political failures, and spiritual malaise. Morgan and Carlson agree that restoring pride, self-respect, and openness is crucial, but recognize the obstacles posed by political correctness, demographic shifts, and ideological clashes.